Hello, I am Jamie from Stonemeyer Games, and I'm here today for a video that I've really been looking forward to for weeks. I'm here with Zach from Covenant. Zach, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I got the email to be on and immediately clicked accept. Very excited to be here and happy to chat.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, as anyone watching this video, or many people know, I talk about my favorite mechanisms in a number of games, but there are a couple types of games that I don't play all that often, and they're like kind of collectible, expandable, even LCGs, living card games. I don't play many of them, but Zach does. And Zach knows them really well. And so I thought, why not have Zach on, especially seeing Zach on his YouTube channel, the Covenant YouTube channel. The Covenant podcast has been amazing over the years. He's great at talking about games. So Zach's here today to talk about his favorite mechanisms in 5 different, really unique card games. Zach, can you give people a little context as to why you know so much about these games?
Oh, for sure. So first of all, I'm old and I've been doing this for a long time. So I was a kid when Pokemon first was coming out, and Pokemon was one of those early card games. Of course, Magic is the grandfather of all of these card games.
Yeah.
But I spent my life playing these card games, building communities around them. I started Covenant when I was 18, very young, and that was about 18 years ago. So our whole existence has really been about finding, supporting, and building communities around what I would call indie card games. So kind of the weirder, off the beaten path. Some of them not so weird, right? I see you pulling up on the screen. We have something like Marvel Champions. That's not a particularly weird or indie game made by Fantasy Flight, who's owned by Asmodee. But for the most part, it's been indie card games. And so there's a lot of games out there, especially card games, that I think most people are completely oblivious to. And we spent our whole lives playing them, supporting them, talking about them, doing streams and podcasts and produce videos and tutorials and all that kind of stuff. So where you might feel that way about those card games, I know in reverse about board games. Been to a Gen Con, been to a lot of the events, right? And engaged around, and I've played a fair amount of board games as well, but I probably have a similar board game level of experience as you in indie card games. So it'll be fascinating to me to talk about some of these mechanics, because when you get really zoned in into a category of something you're doing, it may be very obvious, or it may be something a ton of board games are already doing, this mechanic working this way or whatever, but you just don't know. And every time I talk to someone, I'm excited almost to hear your take on my take as we get into this. So looking forward to the chat.
I'm very curious to hear your favorite mechanisms in these games. I know a little bit about some of them, not so much about other ones. And I do want to give people maybe just a little bit more context about what you do, and you can correct me here. But Zach works with his team at Covenant to make these games approachable and accessible to people. If you watch his videos, you can see they're getting excited about the games, but they're also teaching how they work. And I watched a great video about Gudnak the other day on your channel. That was awesome. But you also... Can you talk about how the subscription model works a little? Well, no, it's a little bit different than most retailers or most people that carry these types of products.
Yeah, I think that's definitely evolved over the years as we have evolved with the industry, with our growth, with our ability to do things just based on kind of growing and slowly. Because we have very, very humble beginnings from small town, didn't have a lot of resources, no investors, that kind of stuff. And the industry has changed dramatically since we started back in 2007. It is pretty amazing what has happened in tabletop gaming since 2007. But, we've found ourselves over time kind of fitting into all these little nooks and crannies of what is it that these games that we love need, and how can we help? And so that is expanded. One of the things we're probably most known for, the 2 things I think, if I had to guess, I don't know, we've done no research on this, but that we're most known for is our YouTube channel and the content we make. And then the second one being our subscription service, where you can just sign up to automatically receive all the future expansions for these games that you play. So within the indie card game, segment, the vast majority of those have pretty routine expansions. LCGs in the 2010s were kind of on a month. That's where subscriptions came from. We got into Game of Thrones LCG and Lord of the Rings LCG it was before the Thrones TV show even happened. So it was like super off the beaten path, indie. No, it's just this tiny little game by this tiny little publisher called Fantasy Flight Games that no one knew about. No, that's aggressive. No one is compared to like Magic, right? It's a tiny little segment. So, but it only took a couple months of trying to basically hunt down these packs to be like, I just want all of them. Can we just get all of them? I actually emailed Robert, who's our operations officer now, and he was handling like our ordering and our shipping and stuff. And it was just like, hey, can you just get me like one of everything that comes out for this? And that's what some people call an aha moment, where it's like, oh, wait, I bet there's a lot of people out there who would want to just click a button and automatically get it. So it started there. And it really just evolved from that, because then we started running into, as we grew and our, the community people engaging with us and watching us grew, we started facing all sorts of different kind of problems. One of the primary was just allocation, which is, distribution wasn't really set up to handle these games, right? They're used to dealing with Magic, Pokemon, or Yu-Gi-Oh, huge scale, or board games, and it's just a very different world. So that we still do subscriptions. That's a huge part of what we do, and I think the majority of how people engage with us. But yeah, I could talk for a long time about it. But short version is just trying to find ways to help these games that we've always loved have a chance at being successful, because it's hard. It's so, as you're aware of being a publisher, it's so hard to do this and to be successful and to figure it all out. And there's no shortage of competition. And when you're a small indie publisher who's just making something that you're really passionate about, and then you show up and, you got to convince distributors to carry it and retailers to carry it and players to be interested in it. Yeah. And in the card game world, it's a little different in board game, because I think in board games, I've correct me if I'm wrong. I'm speaking a little bit out of my depth here, but I know a lot of people that have, the Calyx shelves with like they have the 50 or 100 board games. In the expandable kind of card game world, it's really hard to play more than like one or two, because it's supposed to be a deeper engagement, continual expansions coming out. So when you're an indie card game publisher trying to convince a store to care, they're asking the question, why would I ever carry this, stock it, build community around it, host tournaments, give space to it, when I could just tell people to play Magic? Yeah. So it's tough out there. If you're an indie card game maker, it's tough, but we love them. And there's a reason we love them, which is in all throughout this, talking about my favorite mechanics. Nothing against Magic or what it's done. I think Magic built the industry that we have today. And a lot of the industry grew up around that. And a lot of stores get to exist because of that. And a lot of opportunity was made because Magic existed. But Magic was a game that was designed and published in 1993. And there's other things out there, right? And that's what we've always been obsessed with. So that's the long version of what we do.
Well, we're going to talk about 5 of those smaller games today. And the reason I wanted to ask you that was a wonderful answer. I love you talking about your mission. Part of the reason I wanted to preface this video with that is that if someone watching this learns about one of these games that Zach's about to talk about, and you get excited about them, I truly think the Covenant is a good way to dive into it and get started and give it a try. I have worked with Covenant before. I have a lot of trust with them. And so, yeah, let's talk about Alpha Clash. That. Oh, yeah, thanks, Zach. So we'll start off with Alpha Clash. We'll do these in alphabetical order. And I will say that I'm using images from Board Game Geek, and almost none of these games have more than like a cover image on Board Game Geek. People don't seem to be going to Board Game Geek to talk about them. That's a different topic, but I just wanted to preface that because the images I show today will not be all that helpful. But here's Alpha Clash. Here's what it kind of looks like. Why don't you let us know your favorite mechanism in Alpha Clash and any context around the game that we need to know to understand this favorite mechanism?
Sure. Well, Alpha Clash is, as I mentioned earlier, right? There's games that aren't Magic, but effectively the Magic. If you're familiar with Magic, and I think a lot of people are, but if you're familiar with Magic, it kind of creates the genre, right? And so there's a lot of games that are more in that lane or completely not in that lane. Some of the games I'm going to talk about are a lot more like Magic, and they're innovated in certain ways, and some are nothing like Magic, and that's part of the appeal, right? So Alpha Clash to me is probably the most like Magic on this list. But my favorite mechanic in this game, and I'm going to use Magic terms, even though I'm not a Magic player. I'm saying these words because other people have told me these words. But effectively, when I say like Magic, you can put cards down as resources. You tap those cards to play other cards in your deck. You have essentially, clash cards, which are effectively creatures in Magic on the table, and you're fighting each other and you're trying to get each other to 0 life. But they've done a lot of things to fix a lot of the common problems in Magic, from mana screw and on down the list. But my favorite is actually that every card you play essentially has haste, which means as soon as it hits the table, you can use it.
Mm-hmm.
And what this does is it inevitably means the game leans toward aggro over control, which just means, traditional, these are all card game terms. So I'm trying to like break it down, but effectively in, Magic, you play a card and you can't use it. It's got summoning sickness. You can't use it at first unless it has haste. And so if your opponent removes that from the board, you played a card, they played a card, nothing happened. And so control decks, especially control decks that can remove a lot of cards all at once with a single card, can sort of just stop you from playing the game. And to some people, that is playing the game, but that's not traditionally been my favorite way to play. I'm more of an aggro player. I like to play the things that I want to play and fight each other and then see who wins. And so it's a little switch that game did, but it fundamentally just changes the equation on how you evaluate cards in a game like that. And I've seen so many games and kind of innovate where we're going to fix the mana screw issue in Magic in this way, and we're going to add this thematic thing to it because it's based in whatever universe it's in. But this was the first time I'd seen a game do that particular thing, and it was really amazing what that did to all of the traditional, cards that might look a lot like a Magic card in terms of stat line and ability. But in Magic, these would be insanely good. And in this game, it's actually not that good at all. Or things that would normally be like not play it, vice versa. So that's my favorite like in-game mechanic that they're messing with. But I'm going to kind of do a game outside the game moment on you real quick before I conclude my answer. Another thing that they're doing that I think is really clever in the card game space. Again, I've just been doing this a long time. And we get sent games all the time to try. So you see all these different kind of combinations of things. So they made some really clever innovations to the game system itself. But where I think that game has a lot of potential, and they're really starting to lean into that at this point, the thing I'm about to say at this point, is this game outside the game so the lore of the game is indie superheroes. So it's an indie comic book universe. And they're expressly trying to create fun events instead of just really balanced competitive. It's like more engineered to be story-based, story-driven, and fun. So they're just doing a lot of things on top of the game that remind me of something, another card game, Legend of the Five Rings, but where they're injecting the story and they're injecting the way you play on the outside in a lot of different ways. That's really fascinating to me.
I love that comparison to the Five Rings. I've heard great things about how the outcome of tournaments impacted the story and items and cards in the game. So that's fascinating. And the haste mechanism, every card having haste, I could see how that would have a huge impact on the game compared to Magic.
Yeah. All of a sudden, if you're used to a Magic, like a 4/4 stat line that you just put on the table, suddenly it's actually pretty crazy when you can just play it and go. Like, immediately, here we go. Yeah. And it just leads to these kind of really high-paced, explosive. It feels like comic book superheroes, right? Where there's just this crazy stuff. Not crazy, but action is happening. And you never know your opponent's going, and it's suddenly happening.
Yeah. It works thematically, too. I can see a superhero showing up at the scene of a battle, and they're not just going to stand back and maybe they'll evaluate it for a second, but they're not just going to stand there and wait until the opponent does something. They're going to jump into the fray. Yeah, that's cool. So that's Alpha Clash. Really interesting to hear about that one. I knew nothing about that one. The next one I've heard a little bit about. Let's talk about Ashes Reborn. And I actually have some photos of this one because board gamers know about this game a little bit. Talk about your favorite mechanism in Ashes Reborn.
Man, I love Ashes. It's been around for a minute. My favorite mechanic in Ashes is actually it's before the game even starts, which is they call it the first five. And like I said, I played a lot of card games, and I have until Ashes, I'd never seen a card game do this, which is you actually pick your opening hand out of your deck. So you see the character that your opponent's playing. Each person has a main character, a Phoenix Born. And then you literally just go into your deck and pick any 5 cards you want. And that turns traditional card game everything right on its head, because I mean it's such a simple switch, but then it lets them, and on the design side and even just the card pool, put things into the game and do it in a way that I haven't seen another card game do it. Related, I mean, it's kind of this web of decisions they made that are really impactful in the game. But you have first 5, you start with 10 dice that are your resources. And so most card games in that like Magic lane, you start with no resources and you're slowly building up over time. And you actually start kind of full force in Ashes. You pick your opening hand, you have 10 resources, and you can't get more. The dice are the resources. So every kind of round, you roll the dice, and then you get to use those 10 dice. You go back and forth. But yeah, it's another one of those. Most of the time when you're playing these games, there's some hook moment where, as a card gamer, you go, that is very interesting. I haven't seen it that way before, right? Because there's still deck building, and you're still customizing your deck and playing against different people. But that one definitely, the first time you experience it as a card game, like coming from card games, it's so revelatory, because you've never, up until that point, right? I think it came out the first time in 2016, 2015. It was like late 2015. Yeah. I've been playing card games for 20 years and never played a card game that had that ability. And so it just sort of like bends your brain in a really bizarre way.
Well, so this is a game that I have not played. If you and I sat down to play it for the first time right now, and you told me to pick the 5 cards for my starting hand, I'd be a little daunted by that. How do you approach that with first time players?
Yeah. So in the effectively the starter set, the core set, they come pre-packaged as pre-built decks. And then in the little rule book, it shows you what they recommend as your first 5 in the thing. So there's traditionally a kind of a recommended, and then the way they released those products actually were as decks. So you could buy any product and it's a fully playable deck, and there's a little thing in there that will tell you these are the 5 cards you should start with. But then it's one of the big advantages of card games is you can customize completely. So people go pretty deep on that. Like I would say I've played a fair amount of Ashes, but I'm like an intermediate level Ashes player. And the people that are really good at Ashes, it's like they're doing calculus over there on just even deck building. Because again, if you get to pick first 5, it means you can include a lot of one-of cards in your deck. Yeah. That, Jamie's playing this character. Suddenly I'm going to go start my game with this card in my hand. And a lot of the cards in that game actually stay in play. So you play it and then it stays, and it kind of either offers an ability or something you can do every turn on it. Okay. And so maybe I, have an idea of the character that you're playing and the way they would play. So whereas in a lot of card games, you might have some one-ofs in the deck, just depends on the situation. But this one, I think, really allows you to take that to a next level. And it also means there's less of that, silver bullet moments happening, where because your opponent can do that, you're unlikely to take strategies that can just be stopped by a single card, right? Like it's this. Right. On the one hand, you think, I can go get any silver bullet I want, but then your opponent realizes you have silver bullets, so they they bring their armor, right? They don't allow you to do those things that would just really mess them up.
That's fascinating. And one last question that came to mind is: do you roll the 10 dice before you pick the 5, or do you pick the 5 and then roll the 10 dice?
So you pick the 5 before you roll any dice, but the dice essentially have 3 different symbols on it. So it's a D6, but it's got like 3 basic symbols, 2 I think called the class symbols, and 1 power symbol that on it. And the dice are different colors, which represents like different resource types, and you choose which colors you bring to the game. But during your turn, you can always take a side action to meditate, basically, and discard cards to change dice to whatever side you want. And those cards can come from your deck or your hand. And so even though unfortunately, people, when they see dice, especially card gamers,
Yeah.
in their mind immediately it's like, this is going to be super high variance and like not a serious card game. But Ashes is one of the like most skill rewarding card games I think we carry, and you wouldn't think that by looking at it. It's like we got these colorful dice. It's got dice in general. The art is like very. You were showing some of the cards earlier, but the art and the graphic design on it is very appealing. And a lot of times, you know, in Magic, you'll summon like a dragon or something. This, one of my favorite characters is it's a mouse with a paintbrush. He's called a gilder. He's just gilding things. He's painting them gold. But they have like really like there's all these fun creatures, and it's butterflies and whales, and like so it's very approachable, and it's a cool theme, and it's very fresh. But if you want to be good at it, I think a player that's 5% better than someone else probably wins most of their games, even though there's dice involved. And so that's another one of those mechanics where there are dice, and so it kind of dictates how fast you can move, because you'll need to change those dice over the turn. But you can fix it. It's just a matter of like taking time during the game to change the dice sides, basically.
Interesting. Well, so far we have 2 for 2 that I want to play after hearing more about this. Let's talk about the third one. This is, do you say Gudnak? Gudnak?
I say Gudnak. However,
Gudnak. Okay.
The Tim and Ian, the guys that make this game, so funny, and so there's a humor that's built into this game. And they had a banner at they went to PAX Unplugged, I believe, and they had a banner, and it says like Gudnak, and right below it said, you know, it's Orcish for something, and then it's like, if you know how to pronounce it, please let us know, because there's not like a proper pronunciation. So that's like an inside joke from them and people in the community that no one knows how to pronounce it. So, you know, Gudnak, dealer's choice.
Well, what's your favorite mechanism in this one?
Well, it's now thinking about this list of mechanisms that I'm talking about. It's funny, I'm hitting these different areas. So this was unintentional. It just happened to be alphabetical order, and I'm going through this. But my favorite mechanism in this game is actually the deck building, because they don't have a traditional card game deck building system. And in this game, of all the games that we carry, let me make sure that's accurate before I commit to publicly saying it. But this game, I think, is the closest game we carry to a board game. Okay. So it is a card game, but you'll even see here they've got square cards. And if you're a card gamer, that's like, what is going on? I can't use my sleeves. But it's square cards, and the deck building in this is super minimal. So there is deck building, but they effectively only allow you to make what are the most significant choices in deck building. Like half your deck is effectively picked for you, and it's 10 cards that you have very minimal choice on. And then you get 5 cards that are essentially events, like an instant in Magic, where you can play it and it kind of does a thing. But then you get to choose 5 heroes. And the cards in this game are level 1, 2, and 3, and that's their strength. But you only get 1 level 3 hero, and that's most of the time kind of the card you're building your deck around. Okay. But you're essentially choosing 5 heroes and 5 different tactics. You can't even run multiple copies of these things. And so they boiled down. It is such a, it's especially because this is the first game that they've designed and published. Yeah. They removed any excess anything. And sometimes I've seen people streamline it to make it more approachable or to make it more manageable, and you sort of lose the flavor of the thing, or the whatever makes it interesting. And they somehow didn't do that, right? It's the most minimal deck building I've ever engaged with, and still felt like I was playing a card game fully. And it's painful because choosing, so you get 1 level 3 hero, 2 level 3s, and 2 level 2s. Or no, sorry, 1 level 3, 2 level 2s, 2 level 3s, 2 level 1s. There it is, 1s and 3s. Anyways, short version is you always want to run more than the 5 heroes you can, and it's so hard. Even the 5 tactics, it's just such a important choice, and there's only 20 cards in the deck. So they do deck building in a way that I haven't seen, where I still feel like I'm playing a card game.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think if you were really into board games, or if you're a board gamer and you have a card game friend or vice versa, this is probably right there in that Venn diagram of something both people would super, super, super enjoy. And there's a positional element. It's a whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. It's truly impressive that they were able to somehow hit right in that sweet spot of every decision really matters, but there's no weight. Like all the excess weight is gone.
Yeah, that's impressive to pull off, to have that level, that depth of complexity, but to keep it streamlined. And I heard one of the creators talk about it on a podcast, and the passion with which he spoke about this game and the amount of effort and time they put into it was really admirable.
It feels like, and I'd be curious to know if you experienced this in board games as you've worked publishing and even just playing a bunch. You obviously play a ton of different board games. It feels like the designers, this is like their 10th game they've designed. So another person that designed a ton of card games is Eric Lang, actually, which is an incredibly known board game designer as well. But in the 2010s, he designed a lot of, even the Game of Thrones LCG I mentioned earlier. He was the original designer of that game.
Oh, okay.
And as he designed, it was clear, there's like a trajectory of his design skill and his just his preferences and his understanding and the different things he was interested in experimenting with. This game, Gudnak, to me feels like this is the 5th or 6th game they've designed. Not the first one, which is part of what makes it so notable. Is like there's a maturity to the design that I think you don't see a lot, especially with someone's first at bat. But I'd be curious, have you experienced that sort of thing in board gaming?
To see someone get it right the first time, or to see them evolve over time?
Yeah, I guess both, right? Like,
yeah.
Do you ever play a game and you've never heard of the designer? Maybe it's their first game and you're like, this feels like they've been doing this for a while. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm sure there are a couple different instances of this, but there's a game called Arc Nova. That's, I think, number 2 or 3 on Board Game Geek right now. It's a game I love, and it is that designer's first published game. So maybe he has been designing others that weren't published, but for that to be someone's first game is, I think, an incredible feat.
Yeah. That's actually cool to know. I have played Arc Nova. It's one of the few I have played, especially recently. And it's just that you just keep hearing about it, right? And so if that is their first game, that's exactly what I feel. That's how I feel about Gudnak, where it's like I just can't believe this is someone's first at bat. It's really wild.
Yeah. Well, that's one that I'm also really curious to try. I love the art style in it, but we're going to switch over to Sorcery, which has a very different style of art, but also really well known for its art because it's all hand drawn, I believe. Let me show you a photo of this one. Talk about Sorcery and what your favorite things are about this game.
Man, I could talk about Sorcery for a long time. I honestly could talk about all of these for an hour, probably my favorite, or longer. But unquestionably my favorite mechanic in Sorcery is called Death's Door. And so this is essentially you have a main character, a sorcerer in Sorcery. And you are trying to get your opponent's character to 0 life. It's played on a grid, so it's a positional element. You can even see in that middle card on the bottom, there's like a grid of damage that card does, the Doomsday device. But it's played on a grid, so there's positional element. So it's not, I would say this is very much not in the Magic category. Like it's got some similarities. You have resources and stuff, but I won't get into that. So Death's Door is a mechanic where no matter how much damage you do, when you get your opponent to 0, they immediately go to Death's Door. Okay. And on the turn that they go to Death's Door, they can take no more damage. So you get them to Death's Door, and you could do 100 more damage to them on that turn. It doesn't matter. And then they get to go. And after that point, if they take any damage, they die. But you essentially have this moment, and you can picture in a game of like Magic, right? I'll keep using that as a comparison. If when you got your opponent to 0, you keep playing, and then you have to damage them again on a future turn to win the game. That is what Death's Door is, except for in Sorcery, it's positional. So you play locations on the board instead of resources like Magic, and the locations generate resources for you every turn. But you can effectively tap to move characters from location to location. And so what ends up happening is this has led to easily the most intense, dramatic comeback moments, right? There was a game on stream, actually, Steven and I were playing, and I was way ahead. I got him to death's door and I hadn't taken any damage.
Mm-hmm.
And then he just ran and was hiding and like blocking and like not dying as he slowly just like, I go 20 down to 18, down to 14, down to 10, down to 7. And I'm just like trying to like trap him, right? I'm trying to position things so he can't. And then he just keeps being squirrely and getting out.
Yeah.
And then he actually eventually won the game. So in most games we played, I got him to 0. He just was dominating him, but I kind of overextended to get him to 0. Yeah. And then he had built a board and like could block and like, do his thing. And I literally couldn't get through to finish the job. So that's my personal favorite mechanic, but that game is doing a ton of things that I'm a huge fan of and admire. That game is very good.
It oddly reminds me of a little bit of a sports analogy here. There are a few basketball leagues that have experimented with a new type of end game scoring that results in a game-winning shot in every game. Because I think the idea is, I'm going to describe it probably a little bit wrong here, but they have a threshold. They say, okay, when someone reaches 60 points, when a game reaches 60 points, like in basketball, then they put 11 more points on the as the goal. So if you reach 60 points, I'm not describing it perfectly. Maybe you know what I'm talking about, but you reach a certain threshold and they say, okay, this is the score that someone needs to reach to end. And it means that the game will end in a game-winning shot, and it also gives one of the teams a huge incentive to just like push and push and push, even though they're behind, to reach that.
That's cool.
Yeah, I wish I could.
That would make sense. Like if let's say the number is 60.
Yeah.
And I don't know exactly how it worked, but if suddenly it's like, okay, first person to 70 wins.
Yes, it's something like that. Yeah.
Even if I'm at 50, it's like, okay, but also like that's exactly it, because you get the pressure of, it's almost over. Even once they finally get to, let's say if they were getting to 70, they get to 68. It's like, if they score, they win.
Yeah.
So they will score and win. It's funny. The inverse is true. And I know we're not talking about this game today, but one of my only issues with Keyforge, the card game, was that they had the opposite effect, which is a lot of times you would essentially win on your opponent's last turn because they couldn't stop you, and they knew they couldn't stop you. Yeah. And so the end of Keyforge a lot of times is like, it's my turn. If I don't do anything, you win. I'm looking at my hand. I can't do anything. And then I just say, oh, good game, you win. And it's like, well, that kind of, it's not like I'm doing the last thing, like that kind of thing. But then in the scenario you just described, basketball, there's always that winning shot. And as opposed to even right now, if you're ahead by 20 in a basketball game, fans start leaving at the last 5 minutes. It's like, okay, but they all want to be there for the actual, the winning. That's cool. That's a really cool way of doing it. But yeah, it's the same vibe where you just kind of give a moment, and then the game is different. When you're just trying to do damage to each other and trade efficiently, it's one thing. But if your only goal is don't let me touch you,
right,
you can stop me from doing that. You might not be damaging me or progressing your game state, but like you can make me not do that for 3 or 4 turns just because that's now the thing that you're trying to do.
Yeah, that's really clever.
Yeah, that's good.
Well, that's Sorcery. We have one more here. And this is, I was searching on Board Game Geek. I found this game under a few different names. But Warlord is the name of the game, right?
Yep. Warlord CCG. Warlord Saga, the Storm, maybe all kinds of different names.
Here's a card that I think is this from the recent set, or is this an older version?
So Warlord originally came out in 2001, I believe.
Okay.
And it was published by AEG, who's the same company that made L5R, for 8 or 9 years. And then they actually sold the rights, or they licensed out the ability to make it to a European company who made it for 2 or 3 years and then stopped making it. But then a community group took over, kind of developing independent cards. And then a couple of the guys that were running that group for years got the rights from AEG to actually bring the game back, and they're bringing it back this year. It's getting republished.
Okay.
So I don't know. This is a Warlord card. I don't know when it's from and where it's from. There's like a long storied history of this game, but this is certainly a Warlord card.
Well, what is your favorite mechanism in this game?
My favorite mechanism, Warlord, is the there's a rank and file system. So you start the game, each player has kind of a pyramid in front of them with the top of the pyramid kind of pointing to the player. And it's like a row of 3, a row of 2, and a row of 1 card in the back row. And the thing I really love about this is, first of all, this is another one of those games that is almost nothing like Magic other than it's set in it's fantasy to a degree. But it's not just, the rank and file system is a positional element. So there's melee and there's ranged attacks, right? So melee, you have to be right next to someone. And so my front row can attack your front row. And if you kill something, the rank and file system also means that you can't have more people in the second row than the first row. So if I only have 1 in the first row and 2 in the second row, I have to immediately tap and move one of my things up to the front row. And you kind of fix, your rank and file. And it starts out as a pyramid, but it can get a lot bigger than that, right? So you can put more things in the first row or the second row or the third row. But characters and cards don't have a cost in this game, which is why I love it. So there's not resources, there's no cost. But a card, like a character, might have a level 2 on it, which means when it enters play, it has to enter play in your second row. And things like items that you might attach to the characters actually also have like row requirements. So sometimes a character can't be played unless they're played in row 5. So you would have to actually like build your board to the point where you have a row 5 to put this thing into. Because when you first start, you only have 3 rows. So you couldn't even play a level 5. But it's interesting because ranged, you have like a ranged 1 character who can essentially shoot and skip a row. But a lot of times, like your level 5, like the dragons in the game are big and scary, but you have to play them on like level 5. And so then what happens is most of the time, they can only move like 1 row per turn. And so not only do you not have resource costs, which I love, not having to track, you can't get mana screw, all the stuff, right? It's just like all the problems with resources go away. But the way the rank and file system works as a positional element in the game, and then also you play this big dragon and it's just like, stomping forward one row at a time, and it's coming. And when it gets to that front row, like it's going to just like wipe out some things. It's just very clever. And it's another one of those games that it actually, unlike Ashes, it's the opposite problem. I think it is because all your attacks and stuff are D20 based. It was inspired by a role-playing game. So very similar where, you have an attack stat and you roll and you're trying to beat their defense stat, and it's like a whole thing. But it's just like super fast paced and fun to play, even though the art can feel pretty serious. Like it's fantasy. A lot of the art is hand painted. And it might seem like it's going to be intense, but it is just a rip roaring good time every time you play it. And another part of this is you actually start the game with that rank and file. You start with 5 things on the table. And you get to choose which 5 characters start on the table, other than your Warlord. The game's called Warlord, of course. And the win condition is you have to kill their Warlord. So technically, they could stack up to like 5 rows, put their Warlord in the back. You can't even get to them. So then you just have to chomp through all their dudes to finally get to whoever their character is or whatever. But yeah, that rank and file system. It's another one of those. We when the pandemic hit, we started streaming. We did live streams 5 days a week, and we were doing Throwback Thursdays for like 3 years. We were just playing that's another reason I have so much experience with card games is we played. I mean, we played some games. There's some I was surprised even existed, but we played the Warlord one a couple years ago, and I just remember, again, it was published in 2001 for the first time, and it felt like it was a game from now, like super innovative, super unburdened by like heavy, complicated mechanics. They were just making very lean choices. So that rank and file system's part of that magic, though, right? Where it's like, oh, you solved this thing in a very different way a long time ago, and it's really cool mechanically what you're working with here.
That's fascinating, and really kind of a common thread across many of the games that you've talked about today are they've it looks like they've asked a question like, do we need resources in this game? Can you start with do you have to start with a random hand of cards? Do all cards need to like take the like they've challenged something core to Magic, because there are a lot of this people who designed these games probably did play Magic and have some influence from that. So I love that idea that these designers have challenged what can be seen as an established norm and made something special as a result of it.
Yeah, it's interesting, you know, as compared to something like a board game. Technically, I mean, board game is such a broad term, right? But
yeah,
and we actually have the what's a board game versus a card game conversation all the time. Like, you know, where are those lines? Is Gudnak a board game or a card game, and what does it mean? What if there's a board game that only uses anyways, the reason I say that though is card games are easier to define than a board game, because I think you can put anything you want in a box and call it a board game.
Yeah.
I mean, you could have a single piece of paper that's in a box somehow, and it's a board game, right? Or anyways, there's a huge range. But card games, right? It's like inherently it's card based. There's some level of customization of the cards that you're choosing. You're playing cards to the table. You know, you're playing against or sometimes with the cooperative games, but you're playing against an opponent. And yeah, definitely all the games on the list today have found ways to, inside of the format of I'm printing cards, you have a hand of cards, you're playing cards, and you're engaging with cards back and forth. In a very unique way, in some shape or form, some completely unique, some finding little innovations that change the whole paradigm. But that's I think for me, part of why I love card games is I'm definitely a deeper, not wider kind of guy. So if, you know, the board games I do play, I've played a lot of the board game when it would happen. And I know some people just want to have a little bit of each, right? Just, I want to try this game and this thing. But that if you're a board gamer who likes to go deep, though, I feel like card games is a natural place to look, because you can go super, super deep.
Well, and just so we talked about 5 of the main games that you covered today. There were 5 others that we didn't cover, which I think do apply to what you just shared there. They are Arkham Horror LCG, Earthborn Ragers, Flesh and Blood, Marvel Champions, and I guess that's 9. So that 4 others.
I was gonna say Bulk Box is not quite a game, but yeah.
Okay, yeah. And the reason I didn't choose those games today is because I have talked about them on my channel. I have played those games. I have a video about them. But Zach also has a wonderful channel that I'll link to below, where you can go and see his other thoughts on those games. He has a lot to say about those games and lots of playthroughs and lots to share. Yeah. So thank you, Zach, so much.
You can go super deep. So we have tons of stuff on that stuff if you really want. Well, Jamie, thank you so much for having me on. Absolute privilege. Happy to do it whenever you want.
I really appreciate it, Zach. Take care.
Cheers.